All right, Jonas, I guess we can start. Hi again for those who just joined in, and welcome for this new EDMO Lunch Lecture. My name is Victor Rouillard, and I'll be sharing the session a bit about EDMO and EDMO BELUX before we start. So as you probably know, EDMO is the European Digital Media Observatory. And what we try to do is to bring together fact checkers, researchers, media literacy experts, and media organization to analyze, understand, and fight, I guess, disinformation in some way. And within EDMO, we are the BELUX hub. So the hub that focuses on Belgium and Luxembourg. Within this hub, we of course have three pillars as well: fact-checking, media education, and research. And we try to do, among other things, presentations. So of course, if you're interested, please join the hub. We have a website, we have a newsletter, we have social media, we have a lot of ways that that you guys can follow us if you're interested. And today, for the next 45 minutes or so, we will be listening to Jonas as part of this lunch lecture series. So lunch lectures started around 1 year ago. And so every month we are trying to have a guest either from research, fact-checking, or media literacy. And we try to have those more, let's say, informal lectures where you can learn about the topic related to disinformation, polarisation, issues regarding social media, and so on. We have around 15 people, 16, okay, so close to 20 people online right now. I will try to gather the questions at the end of the talk. But if you have a question, please feel free to ask it in the chat right away. And if it's an easy question, maybe Jonas will be able to answer it right away. If not, we'll keep it to the end, but feel free again to use the chat. It's anonymous. People won't know what you're asking. I will be the only one with Jonas seeing that. So don't be afraid to ask questions. And then now for the talk, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Jonas Lefevere. So Jonas is actually part of EDMO BELUX and has been working with us and with me for the past few years. So I'm really happy to have him present today. Jonas has worked at the University of Amsterdam, Leuven. He was at the VUB at the start of the project, and now he's at the University of Antwerp. He has a PhD in political science and is more on the, let's say, political communication end of the spectrum. But he's here today to present some of his quantitative work, so a survey that he did on the reception of disinformation in Belgium and Luxembourg. So it will be really interesting to hear about so the more quantitative and the more comparative aspects of this research. So Jonas, this floor is yours. You have as long as you want. I won't cut you off. And then again, if you have questions, please ask in the in the discussion. All right, Jonas, the floor is yours. I'm listening. We are listening.
Right. Thanks, Victor, and thanks for the nice introduction. So basically today I'll talk about one of the research efforts that we did in EDMO BELUX, which is a pretty large-scale survey comparatively in Belgium and Luxembourg. Before I get into the talk itself, I do want to recognize the help of other people involved in this study. Victor, you were involved as well in developing the questionnaire, Geoffroy Patriarche as well from Saint-Louis, Tricia Meijer from the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and then Steve Schmidt was instrumental in especially getting a good sample in Luxembourg. So I do want to emphasize that it was very much a collaborative effort. I'm just the guy presenting the findings. So I basically broke down the talk of today into different parts. I'll first basically set the stage. What type of data did we collect? What did the survey look like? What was also the purpose of this survey within the broader aim of EDMO BELUX's research component? And then we get into, I think, the good stuff, so to speak. We'll take a look at, if we look at Belgium and Luxembourg, who gets exposed to disinformation. If people are exposed, do they actually believe that disinformation? And then I think here I get a bit more into broader societal challenges, I think, being posed by disinformation. who gets blamed for disinformation, because we also asked people that participated in the survey, when you think about the issue of disinformation, who do you think is to blame for this? And we found some interesting findings there, also because it relates very much to people's belief in disinformation. Depending on whether you believe disinformation or not, you actually shift the blame for it elsewhere. But I'll get into that at the end of the talk. And then I'll basically wrap up with a brief conclusion and some next steps. Victor, you said that I have 45 minutes. I think and hope that I won't take the full 45, so we have a bit more time for discussion. If there are any questions, just put them in, and then as they come in, I'll try to address them, but we'll see how that goes. All right, so first, why this survey? Well, Victor already mentioned it. One of the EDMO BELUX's goals is a research component. We wanted to also assess the impact of disinformation and disinformation campaigns on society. And EDMO BELUX, in that regard, implemented several studies. So if you go to the EDMO BELUX website, you'll see a lot of different research studies being published there. In this talk, I'll just focus on the survey data, so a comparative online survey that we did in Belgium and Luxembourg, with the chief aim of that survey being to examine, well, who gets exposed to disinformation and who actually begins to believe that disinformation. And then also understanding a bit more from a quantitative perspective, which groups in society are more or less susceptible to disinformation. So practically speaking, essentially in spring 2022, so you have to situate this in time in the wake of the corona pandemic. There were still some cases there, but it was already very much on the decline. But we filled an online survey amongst a total of roughly 1,500 respondents. You see the split there between the different regions. We basically targeted 300 to 400 people in each of the regions to allow for some comparative analysis. And the sample is basically a quota sample. So we try to have samples that roughly match the population in the various regions on age, gender, and education, so that we can hopefully try to at least generalize a bit to these broader populations. If you have more questions about the methodological design, feel free to ask questions about it or consult the report on the EDMO BELUX website. I figured I'll keep it brief on the method side of things and discuss more what we actually find, because I think that's a bit more what people are actually interested in. Right, so the first part of my talk will be, well, who gets exposed to disinformation? Now, in the survey, we devoted quite a bit of time and effort to tracking exposure to disinformation. Basically, to track this, we asked all the respondents in the survey. So basically, on online and traditional media, several news messages appeared in the past few months, and then simply respondents could indicate whether they had seen any of these topics before in the media, yes or no. We used what we call a sort of headline approach, where we distill disinformation and false claims down to sort of these newspaper headlines that we present to the respondents, and then for each of them, they indicate, do you think it's, did you see it or not? As we measured exposure in different 4 factual claims and then 10 false claims. Now, we didn't just take any random false claim. That's important to contextualize the findings I'll present here. We basically only included facts or false claims that were actually fact-checked. Why? Because then we assumed these false claims were at least circulating online enough to warrant a fact-check to begin with. So we're probably oversampling a bit disinformation that's quite highly spread, so to speak, online, which is important to keep in mind. And then, of course, when it comes to actual belief in disinformation, we also wanted to have claims that were fact-checked. So there was at least a chance that people might have seen a fact-check, a debunking of the fake information, which is important to consider when we look at belief in disinformation. So I'll basically first look at exposure. So which of the 5 were most exposed to see a bit overall how widespread was disinformation at the time we launched this survey. And this is across all regions. And we find that, and that's a bit the bad news, is that if you look at the top claim, which is face mask, again, think back, this was 2022, wake of the coronavirus pandemic, and face masks had been a topic of quite some debate, let's say, in society. And you see that roughly half of the sample had seen the claim that it can cause health issues and weaken your immune system, especially the latter part. There was quite some contentious debate on this, but also quite a lot of fact checks debunking it. And then we see that there's a substantial drop-off with 1/3, but for many of these other claims that I'm not even showing, exposure was far lower. Actually, when we saw the 50% for face masks, I was myself a bit surprised because Belgium, Luxembourg in particular, are quite resilient media systems. What we mean with that is these are media systems with strong public broadcasters. And if you look at comparative findings from earlier work on disinformation, we know that these types of systems typically are more resilient to the spread of disinformation. So that we even find 30% for many of these claims was to me quite surprising. Now, of course, we're talking here about exposure. It's not because people indicate that they saw a false claim that they actually believe the false claim. So I'll get into belief a bit later on. Another thing to note is that it was hard to predict based on a topic, for example, which false claim got more or less exposure. We see here, for example, various health-related claims, but some of them had far less exposure than others. So it was quite difficult, based on the topic of the claim itself, to predict which ones got greater or lesser exposure. Which claims get seen has much more to do with who people are and how they use media and other types of socio-demographic characteristics of respondents. Now, some of these claims, very high exposure, so that's what we could say bad news in the sense that some of these claims were quite widespread. But then the good news is, if you look at the overall exposure, and here we basically, and I'll just, so I can mark it a bit, we see here that only 1% of the people in the various regions, so 1% in all regions combined, actually got exposed to all of these false claims. The vast majority of respondents only sees, a few of these claims. So it's not as if, disinformation is so widespread that all of these claims get seen by all people. So there is some exposure to disinformation in Belgian and Luxembourgish societies, but all in all, it's relatively contained, right? So many people see 1, 2, maybe 3 claims, but then as soon as you start going into much more of these, it's a much smaller group. And as I'll show in the subsequent slides, it's also a quite peculiar group of respondents that has high exposure to disinformation. Because what we also do in the executive report is basically present a simplified version of a regression analysis. So we basically regressed, so we analyze basically who gets more or less exposed to false claims. And then we can basically analyze a bit, okay, which factors really matter and which don't. I only show here the ones that really have a significant effect on exposure. So if you look at all respondents here at the bottom, on average, a respondent in the entirety of the sample gets exposed to 2.6 items of disinformation. And then we see that age has a significant impact. What that means is that younger age groups get typically exposed more than older age groups. That has to do, in large parts, with their media use. Younger people typically have a widely different media diet and are more on social media. So we see, if we focus on social media use, that if you're never on social media, you get exposed less to disinformation compared to when you're pretty much on every day on social media. Respondents with a right-wing ideology typically get slightly more exposed to disinformation compared to respondents who self-identify with a more left-wing ideology. But then the big one, and I'll keep coming back to this because I think it's an important finding, we find that people with what we call high levels of conspiracy beliefs have a lot more exposure to disinformation compared to people with low beliefs in disinformation. Conspiracy beliefs refer more to generalized doubts about the role of governments and media. A bit further in my slides, when I get to actual belief in disinformation, I'll talk much more about conspiracy beliefs, because there the impact is even greater. And then I'll expand a bit on this concept of conspiracy beliefs, but already note that these conspiracy beliefs also affect exposure to disinformation. And then finally, if you're more politically interested, you also have slightly higher exposure, which is to be expected. People with a high level of interest in politics typically use more media in general. So if you use more media in general, you're also just by chance more likely to encounter disinformation. Now I'll turn to belief in disinformation. Now, for these same claims, so the 4 factual and the 10 false claims, we also asked, basically on a 11-point scale from 0 to 10, we asked respondents to indicate, do you think this claim is totally unbelievable or totally believable, right? Now, I'll start with the good news. I think you already know what's coming next. The good news is that if we look at the disinformation items, and these are the top scoring disinformation claims, on average, they are scored less than 5 out of 10. So they are more evaluated on the side of unbelievable, which I would think is a good thing. So overall, most of the respondents in our survey indicate, for example, that they tend to disbelieve that wearing a face mask can cause health issues and weaken your immune system. So on average, these false claims are not believed. Now, as I'll get into a bit later on, we do see large variations. A subset of the respondents does believe disinformation and believes it quite a lot, so to speak. But overall, if you look at the general population, there's not really much belief in disinformation, because I'm showing here the highest scoring ones. Much of the other ones scored even lower, right? Now, the bad news, there's a couple of things that we might say might be problematic or might be an indicator of a broader societal issue at play here. The bad news is, for me, related to the factual claims. These are the scores of the 4 factual claims. So a claim like, when the price for motor fuel, like diesel and petrol, rises, the state profits. This is just the state taxes fuel. 6.4, which is more than 5. I'll give you that. But it's also not quite total belief. So even about some of these more basic facts, doubt starts to creep in. And it definitely starts to creep in if the knowledge concerned is more specialized. Think, for example, that honey can be an alternative to antibiotics, which has been demonstrated. It's more specialized knowledge. And here you see that the difference between a false claim and a factual claim is quite close. 4.6 for the face masks, 4.9 for the honey claim. Likewise, the Zelensky banning of political parties scores below 5. NATO spending for Belgium, NATO for Belgium and Luxembourgish spending on NATO also just around the midpoint. So there is a lot of doubt about some of these specific claims that are circulating online. This is, I think, an indication of a broader issue that starts to emerge, is that we have disinformation circulating online. There's an explosion of news sources, so there's more and more information circulating online. And the fact that people are aware that some of these claims might be false, the good thing is that people become more skeptical of incoming information. The bad news is that people become more skeptical because some of the more factual claims are also sometimes criticized by alternative news websites. And different news websites give different takes on current events. And so you get into sort of this information context where lots of different facts, versions of facts are circulating online. And then even if you have a public and a society that's quite resilient to this information because it is skeptical, you see the downside might be that when it comes to more factual claims, actual belief of those also is on the decline. And I think this resonates a bit with other research by, for example, I think Peter van Aalst also asked subjectively people to evaluate a bit, how often do you doubt information that you encounter online? And he saw that this sort of doubt, uncertainty about, is this true or is this not true? Is this fact or fiction? That doubt is quite prevalent in today's society, even in societies such as Belgium, perhaps also Luxembourg, which in general are seen as quite resilient because of their quite strong media systems. Now, when it comes to belief in disinformation, we can sort of replicate the analysis from before, looking at, in general, who believes disinformation, and then splitting out the overarching numbers by different subgroups of respondents. In general, we sort of created a scale that measures average belief in these 10 false claims. So a score above 5 indicates belief, a score below 5 indicates disbelief. So we'll start from the top. Good news first, on average, across these 10 claims, people tend to not believe false claims. But depending on the subgroup in the sample, we find that belief is higher. Amongst younger people, belief in disinformation tends to be higher compared to older groups. Between men and women, we find a slight difference, but not a huge one. We do find that respondents who identify with right-wing ideologies tend to have more belief in disinformation compared to people who identify with the left side of the political spectrum. And once again, and even greater than before, the impact of conspiracy beliefs. I'll go into it a bit more on the next slides. If people, and this is a small group of the sample, but that small subsegment of the sample that has high conspiracy beliefs tends to, on average, across the 10 items, tends to believe them. They have an average of 5.3 on these. That means that typically, for some of them at least, they score very high in the belief scale. In contrast, for the vast majority of people, they tend to have low conspiracy beliefs. And for them, the average score is much lower and tends very much to side towards disbelief. Then when it comes to more trusting respondents, we also find slightly higher scores. But again, if we compare it to the impact of conspiracy beliefs, its impact is much more limited. And people that are more dissatisfied with democracy tend to also slightly more believe in these false claims. Now, on these conspiracy beliefs, because I think it's also an important thing to keep into account. So belief in these generalized conspiracies is far and away the biggest explanatory factor in both exposure and belief in disinformation. Other factors matter as well, but compared to the impact of conspiracy beliefs, it's not even close. Now, these are pretty outlandish claims. I've just sampled a few of these, right? So this is we ask people, do you agree or disagree with the following claims? So for example, governments are involved in the murder of innocent citizens and or well-known public figures and keep this a secret. Evidence of alien contact is being concealed from the public. So people with high levels of conspiracy beliefs agree with quite outlandish claims. Admittedly, this is only a very small subsegment of the sample. This is important to keep into account. We're not talking about huge percentages of people here, but they do exist, right? Now, why do I think this matters? Well, it matters not just because of this, because it affects exposure and belief in this information. It also matters because it's quite likely that if you hold these more general doubts about what the government and what the media are telling you, it's quite likely that you won't just believe false claims about COVID-19, but when, for example, a new crisis emerges, such as the Ukraine war, where new disinformation starts to emerge, that it's quite likely that that subsegment of the population just jumps ship and also starts to believe this new breed of disinformation. These are people that, in my view, are very susceptible to new disinformation, simply because they have a quite deeply ingrained doubt about whatever it is that the mass media, politics, fact checkers are telling them. So I think for that group, it's especially difficult to, even with fact checks, for example, they might look at a fact check and just disregard it altogether as sort of, yeah, that's the mainstream narrative. I don't buy it. It's all a conspiracy. So for me, that group especially is quite problematic. And also, I think one of the biggest challenges in, okay, we can try to talk about how do we fight disinformation and how do we try to gets to a place where disinformation is less of an issue. I think there's a small subsegment of the population where it's really hard to still convince people of sort of these alternative, well, to them at least, alternative interpretations of facts. Okay, I still have some time. So here I'll basically freewheel a bit based on that last point. So there is a small percentage of respondents with high conspiracy beliefs. So keep that in the back of your head when I get into the last part. That is, who gets blamed for disinformation? We had lots of different questions beyond just exposure and belief. We also asked about, for example, who gets blamed, or what else was there? Yeah, some more, some other aspects of fake news, which I won't get into too much. I'll focus on the blame question because it sort of builds on this aspect of, okay, there's in the broad population, perhaps there's not a huge issue. The issue is mostly with a small subsegment of the population. And I think that's where the challenge is when it comes to, okay, how do we sort of get away from disinformation as a threat? So you see here, we basically asked respondents, okay, to what extent do you think the following factors caused the issue of disinformation? And then on an 11-point scale from 0, meaning it didn't cause it at all, to 10, it caused it a whole lot, right? You see overall that it's pretty close, right? You see that the news consumption of regular people is seen by many respondents as one of the causes. So people are a bit self-aware that their own media consumption might also actually be a cause of belief in disinformation, because they tend to get their news maybe from not the most reliable news sources. They also are cognizant of the role of social media platforms and their algorithms that might help the spread of disinformation. But we also included that the news coverage of traditional media, such as newspapers, television, broadcast, and radio, to what extent is that a cause? Now, these score lower, but you can already tell that on average, it's not like this gets 0 out of 10, right? My second point is these averages, again, conceal a lot of heterogeneity. Some people score or put the blame fully with social media. Other people would put the blame fully with traditional media or even with government policy. Now, the people that put the blame with traditional media and government policy tend to have a different profile than those that look towards regular people and social media platforms. So if we basically run a model and try to understand a bit, okay, where do people put the blame? I won't go into everything, but you can tell, for example, that age has a negative correlation with putting the blame on legacy media and government policy. In human language, what that basically means is, if you're younger, you put the blame more with legacy media and with the government, right? We also see that younger people tend to have slightly higher exposure and belief in disinformation. So similarly, if we look at to what extent do you actually believe in disinformation, well, it's those people that actually start to believe disinformation that put the blame with legacy media and with the government, and not with social media and regular people. And the same for conspiracy beliefs. There, the pattern is even more straightforward. These people basically put the blame fully with legacy media in government policy. We had an open-ended question in the survey where we asked, well, if you think about fake news, what does that mean for you? Well, these are people that put in such open-ended questions. Well, for me, what I see on television is fake news. These people are fully in social media. So people with high conspiracy beliefs put much less blame on social media. In fact, they see social media as sort of a way out of the mainstream narrative that they feel is lying to them. So these are people that are, I think, in partly a different information reality, because they are just have vastly different patterns of media consumption, have vastly different beliefs. And as a result, when new disinformation campaigns are spreading online, these are people that are sort of the first adopters of these alternative news stories. And then we also see that when it comes to, where was it? For example, media trusts and political trusts, they tend to shift a blame a bit more to regular people as well, and social media. But I think here in these last two columns, that for me is where the interesting patterns are, because those people that put the blame there more will be that much harder to reach with any sort of campaign against disinformation, because these are people that have sort of said, you know, whatever these elites are telling me, whether it's journalists, whether it's politicians, it's all a conspiracy, and I turn away from it. And it becomes very hard to sort of communicate with them. And I'll end with a very brief note on something that I don't really get into in the executive summary of the report, but I still think it's sort of, it's a different perspective on the point I was making earlier. So when I say that some people turn away from these journalists and elites, well, we also asked in the survey a typical effective polarization question, which we basically ask respondents, well, can you rate the following various groups on 0 to 100 thermometer scales to indicate a bit whether you feel very warm, nice, good towards these groups, or whether you feel very cold and negative towards these groups. We also asked this for the general population, and we typically look at, you know, compared to general people living in Flanders, do you score different specific groups in society higher or lower? Now, some interesting findings emerged. So, of course, everyone hates politicians, so they score worst, minus 31. So people dislike politicians. Also, asylum seekers score lower. Civil servants score lower. Us scientists, we used to enjoy an advantage that we were seen as more reliable, or people felt warmer towards us. I'm afraid that advantage has a bit dissipated, so we just score average. journalists, and I think here we get also into turning away from traditional and legacy media. Journalists score minus, so below, more negatively compared to the general population, but also, for example, judges, the judiciary system, also -10, right? So overall, you see a bit, on average, journalists, judges, for me, those are very interesting groups because they're a bit, you could say, well, everyone hates politicians and has for a long time. That is not new. What is new is for me in these groups. And then at the end of the full reports, I also split this out. What if we look at these scores and we split them out by those people that have a high belief in disinformation and versus people that have low belief in disinformation? You see that it doesn't matter for politicians, doesn't really matter for asylum seekers, doesn't matter for civil servants. But here it begins to matter. Scientists, you get a 10-point difference. People that believe in disinformation also are more doubtful of science. They are definitely more doubtful of what journalists are doing. And I think this is also putting into doubt the judiciary system. Remember what I said about these generalized conspiracy beliefs. These are beliefs that people start to hold, that basically there's a big conspiracy going on and everyone is involved. The media, the political elites, but also the judicial system. And I think this is for me also sort of an indication of the same pattern emerging. Overall, I think the good news is Belgian and Luxembourgish society is quite resilient to disinformation, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And there is a subsegment of the population that is quite susceptible to disinformation. I'll wrap it up with a conclusion and some next steps that we have planned based on this research. So, despite being seen as systems that are quite resilient to disinformation, Belgian and Luxembourgish citizens are exposed to disinformation, not by huge amounts, but many people have encountered some of these false claims. The good news, citizens generally do not believe the false claims, so I do think that's important to note, that on average, across the entirety of the sample, we find that people side with disbelief of false claims. But some citizens, especially those with more generalized conspiracy beliefs, do believe disinformation and are probably quite susceptible to new disinformation. Citizens have also begun to doubt factual information. And we also see that if you believe disinformation, and especially these conspiracy theories, you tend to also put the blame more on government and legacy media, which to me indicates a sort of like split where there's part of the society that's just in a different information ecosystem. Now, for next steps, if you want to read more also on the methodology, you can find the full executive summary of the report on the EDMO BELUX website, and what we plan to do in more paper academic articles based on this survey is to explore further the region-specific disinformation. I didn't get into it a whole lot in this talk. I simply don't have time. But that's one of the plans that we have to investigate a bit more, because we do find quite some differences, especially between Luxembourg and Belgium. Between the different Belgian regions, there are some differences, but less outspoken. And it could have to do also with the media system there. But that's for future research. Right, I'll wrap it up here. Thanks for your attention. And of course, if there are any and all questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Jonas. I don't see any questions yet, so if you have a question, now is the time to write it down, or you can send us an email later. But let's give them a few minutes to see if questions are coming in, because I do want to react on a few of the things you said. Of course, we've discussed this before, but I think that this survey and the work in general we do at EDMO is quite reassuring in terms of disinformation in the strict sense, like fake news, but also quite worrying if you take this information, with a wider definition. You said trust in institution, trust in media, trust in government. And I think your survey shows that also in a way quite well. I do want to ask you to expand on two things, and you pick up whatever you want. The first one is, of course, what you finished with is the differences, the regional and the community, let's say, differences. If you want to tell us just a little bit about it, you said there might be, or there is probably differences between Luxembourg and Belgium, maybe less within Belgium between Flanders, Wallonia, or French-speaking Belgium, which I think is also quite reassuring. But if you want to expand a little bit on that, that'd be nice. And then the second question I want to ask you, or maybe it's just a food for thought or something. I think that it's super nice that in this survey you measure exposure and belief, and you kind of mix it a little bit when you do in your talk. But I was wondering if you see, or if you think we could try and analyze if there is a direct relation between exposure and belief, because some of the new theories suggest that, well, exposure is actually a good thing. Like if you expose teens and people a lot of disinformation, they will kind of realize that it is crap and they will believe it less. You know, this is kind of the vaccine theory, the inoculation theory. So I was wondering if you saw that. I think in your sample, there is a link between, I think the younger people are more exposed and also a little bit more believers. So maybe there is a bad correlation, but yeah. So if you want to expand on that a little bit, that'd be nice as well. And I see there's someone in the chat, but I'll read it while you speak.
Right. I'll maybe start with your second question first. So the link between exposure and belief, I think it's I understand this inoculation theory, this idea of, basically you just show them
bunch of crap.
a bunch of crap, so people become more doubtful of it. I think for me, and I saw Trisha's, so Trisha is also in the, Trisha and I also did an experiment where we looked at this. So we showed people a fake tweet of a politician, and then we measured, did exposure to that fake tweet cause people to increase their belief in the claim? And our expectation was sort of the reverse of inoculation, because you also have this notion of repeated exposure, where if you see, for example, a claim about ivermectin, and you forget about it, and then you see it again online. This repeated exposure theory argues, well, at the moment you see it again, you start to think back, I've seen that somewhere before. But by that time, you have forgotten the actual source of the claim. What people tend to do, they argue, is, well, at that point they say, well, that must have been a trustworthy source because I'm seeing it again now. So this repeated exposure says, well, if the more you're exposed, the greater belief will be. But we actually found the reverse, much more in line with inoculation theory. So what we show is, if you show people a false claim, and they saw it before, but already rejected the claim at that point, it's sort of it's almost perfect inoculation. It even decreases their belief even more, because they start to see, okay, it's that again. It's that bullshit claim again that I already seen before. If people saw the claim before and were doubtful or somewhat believing in the claim, then we do see that it sort of enhances their belief. And again, that's why it's similar to what I mentioned before about this sort of, you have a small subsample of people that do believe these claims. And it makes them more susceptible. So I like the idea of inoculation and trying to, through media literacy, or at least exposing people and making them more aware of the fact that there are false claims out there. But I think for some people that are already a bit down the rabbit hole, so to speak, that becomes much harder to do, I think, because they're already on board with these beliefs. And then on the differences between the regions, the basic pattern that we find is that both exposure and belief is lower in Luxembourg. But we haven't done a comparative regression analysis, so integrating all the regions at one. And then sort of, I want to control for media use, because it could be that because maybe the public broadcaster, for example, has a stronger reach in Luxembourg, that explains why exposure and belief is lower. I don't know. Or is it because of other differences? For example, more trust amongst citizens, for example, that we don't know yet. And but we see the overall pattern quite straightforward: lower exposure and belief in Luxembourg compared to Belgium, and then a bit more, I think, in Brussels and Flanders compared to Wallonia, but very slight differences. And I think the big difference is between the two countries that we see.
Yeah, and that calls for even more research on, let's say, European level, because
Yes,
in
indeed.
the end, Luxembourg and Belgium are very different countries, but on the European scale, they might be closer to one
They
another
are
than,
quite similar cases,
yeah.
which I think helps the comparison in this. So you're not, because I like the fact that we have quite closely linked countries here, because it sort of minimizes the differences, and then it's easier to attribute the differences that we do find to slight differences between the systems, which would be much harder in most different systems design, where I think we need a lot more countries. But indeed, let's hope that in the future rounds of EDMO, there's also some place for research to be done on that.
Of course.
And then I think Trisha asked, I think the study highlights the domestic challenge of which tends to receive more attention. That the foreign challenge tends to receive more attention. The third, I think priorities in terms of response should lie. I think, and it's been said before, but I think, for example, media literacy and sort of catching the issue early, because I think the different media diets of young people especially can send people down a rabbit hole if you're not careful. And I think, for me, the most worrying part is these conspiracy beliefs, that once you're on board with some of these, that you quite fundamentally, I think, in my view at least, start to doubt what media politics is telling you, that you just become a lot more susceptible, and you're even starting to reject any of these interventions at EU level that are being proposed, because a lot of that, also has to do with are people open to receive the disinformation that is out there? And I think for the vast population, you see, no, they tend to maybe doubt a bit, but mostly reject the disinformation. But what worries me is that that small subsegment starts to grow, because there, I think, I think the only way to do that is prevention. Basically, give people the tools to sort of critically look at whatever it is that they encounter on social media, especially where some of these, really outlandish claims are being made.
And that I think relates. We have two questions from Natalie. Maybe we can then start with the second one, because I think that relates to that. You talk about prevention, and here she asked about the role of education, and if you see a difference in your sample.
I don't think we saw a big effect of education. It was much more, especially in the regression analysis, it didn't have a huge impact. It was much more age, media diets, for example, and especially, of course, as soon as we put conspiracy beliefs in there. And I saw that you asked about, could you elaborate on how did you measure it? So we used the brief generalized conspiracy beliefs measure of Brotherton. I think they have a paper. Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but Brotherton, they basically have this generalized conspiracy beliefs scale. And as I said, these are very outlandish claims, which is a drawback of including that, because for the small subsegment that does believe them, they have no problem telling you they agree with a lot of these claims, but it also tends to offend a lot of people that don't believe in conspiracies. But I think, if you want, I can email you the reference a bit later on, but it's the scale of Brotherton that we used. And then education, are the people who are skeptic towards honey being as effective as the same people who doubt the other facts and scientific consensus? I must admit that I haven't yet looked at correlations between individual items a whole lot. For now, we simply did the overall tally of just, how many of these do you tend to believe. But what we did notice is that if we scaled the individual, the 10 disinformation items, these formed a very reliable scale, which suggests that if you believe one of these false claims, you tend to believe the other ones. However, I haven't done the same exercise, including 14 items in the scale, including the 4 factual, because it would be interesting to see a bit, is there a negative correlation with believing the factual items versus the disinformation items. I think it's a good suggestion, but I can't give a better answer than this is something I'll probably do, because I think it would indeed be interesting to look at building a bit of a profile, or some people, rejecting facts, accepting false claims, and do they have a distinct sociodemographic profile?
But that relates then to Julia's question afterward, which is on the profile this time, but on the people with conspiracy belief. So is it younger people, older people, everyone? Subset too small to measure?
My answer is I have not yet run that analysis, but I will definitely do it. For now, in the report, we were mostly interested in just raw exposure and belief in disinformation. And then we discovered that, conspiracy beliefs, I'm really happy that we have it in a survey, but I mostly treated it as sort of an explanatory factor to explain exposure and belief. I haven't looked at it as sort of, okay, what explains conspiracy beliefs themselves? I have to look at it. I haven't run the regression analysis. So with conspiracy beliefs as the dependent variable. So I can't, I'm sorry, Julia, but I can't. I'll run the analysis.
The good news for Julia is the people who are doing qualitative research on this part of EDMO are doing interviews with this kind of people. So we might have more to we might have
maybe
more
you
to
can
present.
Comment on it. Huh?
Yeah. Well, we are actually also running the analysis, but maybe in a few months I'll be the one doing the lunch lecture. If that's something that interests people.
But maybe I can say a bit about it, because
if you want,
we do see in the regression analysis that what I said earlier, conspiracy beliefs is the main factor explaining belief in disinformation. And who believes disinformation? Well, it tends to be more younger people, people with slightly higher exposure, a bit, I think, more dissatisfaction with democracy in society, that sort of thing. But in terms of education, it's not in the graphs, not because it's not in the regression analysis, because it doesn't give a significant effect above and beyond the other factors in the regression. But if I have to say about who is probably in the high conspiracy beliefs profile, it's probably more younger people, probably those with more dissatisfaction of democracy, less trust in traditional media, that sort of thing.
And what about political engagement and political opinions? Because from what we've seen in the interviews, those are people who are actually highly politically involved. Like they won't go and vote. They don't trust the politicians anymore, but they're really knowledgeable about politics. They know the different parties. They know the electoral system. They know all that stuff. So maybe that's also something that plays a role as well.
Yeah, what we saw with belief, so belief in disinformation is the right wing side of the political spectrum tends to have more belief, which is in line with what we saw in, there was German research on Alternative für Deutschland, where supporters of that right-wing populist party also had higher belief in disinformation. I also looked at, is it more a curvilinear effect, where it's more the extremes of the spectrum? In our sample, it didn't emerge. That pattern didn't emerge. So it was just mostly the right side of the political spectrum. Of course, that also has to do with the political offer, which is different. And depending on which parties on the radical left might emerge, you might see a changing pattern there. For what we see now in our Belgian and Luxembourgish sample, it's more the right-wing side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, and that might be really different, for example, between Wallonia and Flanders, just because there is difference in opinion towards the left, for example.
Yes, indeed. And again, we haven't looked too much into the different regions. this sort of integrated analysis. But it's also, yeah, you have to make a lot more trade-offs with statistical power, because I think we have a nice sample of 1,500. But as soon as you start adding in regional differences, you split up your sample a bit more, sample sizes decrease. So yeah, anyone with a statistics background knows the challenges there. So we have to be a bit more parsimonious in our model. Julia, I do the follow-up. I think it would be just to coordinate knowledge towards specific subjects. Yeah, I think we didn't measure, if I recall correctly, factual political knowledge, for example. Yeah, it's a good idea to take a look at, okay, to what extent do people have some basic knowledge about different topics, and then try to relate that with, are you doubtful or certain? What I will say is that people can be very certain about their knowledge and be totally off. So be very certain about thinking they know something, and then it turns out that a lot of these are not correct or incorrect, and then are also quite resilient to being corrected against it. But I don't think we have a lot of these other knowledge measures in the survey. Yeah, we have to choose, of course, what we include.
Yeah, you'd have to give them a test. You'd have to give them a test before they start the survey, which would be hard.
That's true.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. If some question emerge, please do send us an email. As Jonas said, there will be an executive summary, which is a longer summary that will be posted online. And then, of course, for researchers, we can provide access to study, or if you have questions, you can answer, of course.
Yeah.
We will have more lunch lectures coming up, probably late November, early December, and then we'll start again next year. So please follow us if you want to know who's going to be next. If you want to suggest someone, this is also something that's possible. We are a small community, so if there is someone that you would like to hear and that would be a good fit for the lunch lecture, don't hesitate. Or even you might be a person in the audience right now who would like to present something. That is also possible. So really don't be afraid to send us an email, either regarding questions, with propositions, anything. We're always happy to hear about you guys. And if there is no other questions, I think, Jonas, I just have to say thank you. And
you're welcome. Happy to do it.
Yeah, see you soon. Have a good afternoon, and everyone have a good week, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
See you, Jonas. See you, everyone.